What happened to the family of Heinrich Himmler after World War II? The man who orchestrated the systematic murder of 6 million Jews, the architect of the Holocaust, left behind a wife, a beloved daughter, and a secret second family. When the Third Reich collapsed in May 1945, these individuals faced an impossible burden. How do you live with the legacy of one of history's most monstrous criminals? Some defended him until their dying breath. Others lived in secrecy, hiding behind false names. In this video, we'll uncover the hidden lives of Heinrich Himmler's family members and reveal the shocking paths they took after the war ended. Heinrich Himmler was not just any Nazi leader. As Reichsführer SS and one of the most powerful men in Nazi Germany, he commanded the entire SS apparatus, including the Gestapo and the concentration camp system. He was Adolf Hitler's right-hand man in implementing the final solution. Yet this man, responsible for unfathomable atrocities, had a family, who knew him as husband, father, and lover. Understanding what happened to them offers a disturbing window into how the families of war criminals grappled with guilt, denial, and the weight of history. Let's begin with the woman who stood by Himmler's side for nearly 2 decades, his wife, Margarete Himmler. Margarete Himmler was born Margarete Boden on September 9, 1893, in Bromberg, which was then part of the German Empire and is now Bydgoszcz, Poland. She was 7 years older than Heinrich, a fact that would cause tension with his Catholic family when they married. In a twist of profound irony, Margarete initially trained as a nurse with the noble intention of saving lives during World War I. After that war concluded, she transitioned to working at a German Red Cross hospital, and with financial support from her father, she even managed her own private nursing clinic in Berlin. This was a woman dedicated to healing, to preserving life, yet she would marry a man who would orchestrate death on an industrial scale. Margarete first crossed paths with Heinrich Himmler during one of his lecture tours in 1927. At the time, Himmler was a rising figure in the Nazi Party, serving as Deputy Reichsführer SS under Erhard Heiden. His attraction to Margarete was immediate and intense. He was captivated by her blue eyes and blonde hair, features that matched the Aryan ideal the Nazis would later promote so obsessively. They married in July 1928, despite Heinrich's initial apprehension about introducing Margarete to his deeply Catholic family. There were multiple concerns: their 7-year age difference, Margarete's previous marriage to a hotelier, and her Protestant faith. These were significant obstacles in the eyes of Himmler's conservative Catholic parents. Eventually, however, his family grudgingly accepted Margarete into the fold. On August 8, 1929, the couple welcomed their daughter Gudrun into the world. This child would become the center of Heinrich Himmler's emotional life, the one person he seemed genuinely capable of loving without reservation. For Margarete, motherhood came relatively late. She was 35 years old when Gudrun was born. The little girl would be their only child together, though Himmler would later father 2 more children in secret with his mistress. Margarete was far from a passive spectator in her husband's political activities. She became a member of the Nazi Party in 1928. The same year she married Heinrich. She regularly arranged and hosted gatherings for the spouses of high-ranking SS leaders at their home. These were not merely social occasions, they were opportunities for the wives of the Nazi elite to network, to reinforce party ideology, and to present a unified front. Despite her active involvement in these circles, Margarete was notably unpopular among the other Nazi wives. She had a difficult personality, and tensions frequently arose. During the Nuremberg Rally in 1938, she had such severe disagreements with the other women that they collectively refused to follow her lead. A remarkable rejection within the rigidly hierarchical Nazi social structure. By the end of 1939, as war engulfed Europe, Margarete had taken on an official role overseeing the operation of Red Cross hospitals throughout the Berlin-Brandenburg region. This position sent her on missions to various countries and regions under German Wehrmacht occupation. She kept detailed diaries of these trips, documents that would later provide chilling evidence of her awareness of Nazi atrocities. In March 1940, she travelled to occupied Poland, visiting Posen, which is now Poznan, as well as Łódź and Warsaw. What she wrote in her diary from this trip reveals her own deeply held anti-Semitic beliefs. She described what she saw with horrifying callousness. Then I was in Posen, Łódź and Warsaw. This Jewish rabble Polacks, most of them don't look like human beings and the dirt is indescribable. It's an incredible job trying to create order there. These were not the words of an innocent bystander. Margarete was an active participant in the Nazi worldview, someone who dehumanized entire populations and supported the regime's brutal occupation policies. Her efforts in organizing Red Cross operations in occupied territories were rewarded. She eventually achieved the rank of colonel within the German Red Cross. This was no small accomplishment, and it demonstrated both her organizational capabilities and her commitment to the Nazi cause. As late as February 1945, with the Third Reich crumbling around them, Margarete remained devoted to her husband and to the illusion of German victory. She wrote to Gebhard Himmler, Heinrich's brother, expressing her continued faith. "How wonderful that he has been called to great tasks and is equal to them. The whole of Germany is looking to him." This was written just 3 months before the war's end, when any objective observer could see that Germany's defeat was inevitable. Her blindness to reality, or perhaps her desperate need to believe in her husband, persisted almost until the very end. April 1945 brought a final painful meeting between Margarete and Heinrich. Their marriage had effectively ended years before this moment, though they had never formally divorced. In 1941, Margarete discovered that Heinrich was secretly entangled with his secretary, Hedwig Potthast, and that he had fathered 2 children with her. The revelation devastated Margarete, but divorce was not an option for high-ranking Nazis. It would have been a scandal that could damage Himmler's standing, so they maintained the facade of marriage while living essentially separate lives. That final meeting in April 1945 would be the last time Margarete ever saw her husband alive. Just weeks later, on May 23, 1945, Heinrich Himmler committed suicide by biting into a cyanide capsule while in British custody. He had been captured while attempting to flee in disguise using a false identity. When British soldiers discovered who he really was, he chose death over facing justice. For Margarete, this was the beginning of a long, painful reckoning. When the war concluded, Allied authorities subjected Margarete to numerous investigations, probing the extent of her knowledge regarding her husband's affairs, both his extramarital relationship and his crimes against humanity. She consistently denied any awareness of the Holocaust, claiming ignorance of the concentration camps and the final solution. She pleaded to be cleared of Nazi association, desperately trying to absolve herself of complicity in her husband's crimes. The investigators were skeptical. How could the wife of the man who orchestrated the Holocaust truly know nothing? But proving what she knew versus what she chose not to see was difficult. After a prolonged deliberation that stretched across years, a German Denazification court reached its verdict in 1953. Margarete was deemed a profiteer of the Nazi regime, someone who had materially benefited from the Third Reich without necessarily being directly responsible for its crimes. Her sentence was relatively light, 30 days of penal labour. However, the consequences extended beyond this brief incarceration. She was stripped of her voting rights and became ineligible for any pension. For a woman now in her 60s, this was a harsh blow. She had no independent means of support and no professional career to fall back on. After her release from penal labour, Margarete made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She would disappear. She adopted the pseudonym Margarete Boden, using her maiden name, and tried to live in obscurity. She avoided all contact with her former social circle from the Nazi years. She gave no interviews, made no public statements, and sought no attention whatsoever. Her goal was simply to survive, to live out her remaining years without being constantly reminded of who she had been married to and what that marriage represented. Margarete Boden, as she now called herself, lived this quiet, hidden existence until her death in 1967. She was 73 years old. She died in relative poverty, a far cry from the comfortable life she had enjoyed as the wife of one of Nazi Germany's most powerful men. In the end, she had tried to distance herself from her past, but whether she ever truly confronted the moral implications of her husband's actions or her own complicity in supporting the regime remains unknown. She left behind no memoirs, no final confessions, no attempt to justify or explain herself to history. But Margarete was not the only woman in Heinrich Himmler's life. While she struggled to maintain the appearance of a proper Nazi marriage, Himmler had embarked on a secret relationship that would produce 2 more children. Hedwig Potthast was born on February 5, 1912, making her 19 years younger than Heinrich Himmler. She began working as his private secretary in 1936, when she was just 24 years old. Himmler, then 46, and married with a 7-year-old daughter, developed feelings for the young woman. By 1939, their relationship had evolved from professional to romantic, though they kept it carefully hidden from public view. The relationship between Himmler and Hedwig was unusual, even by the standards of Nazi leadership, many of whom had mistresses. Himmler sought and received Heinrich Müller's approval, not a divorce from Margarete, which would have been scandalous, but permission to maintain both families simultaneously. This arrangement reflected the twisted Nazi ideology that encouraged SS officers to father as many racially pure children as possible, even outside of marriage. Himmler, who publicly promoted these eugenic policies, was privately living them. On February 15, 1942, Hedwig gave birth to their first child, a son named Helge. The birth took place at the Hohelichen Sanatorium, a facility run by SS doctor Karl Gebhardt. This was not a typical hospital, it was a place where Nazi elites could receive discreet medical care. 2 years later, on July 20, 1944, Hedwig gave birth to their second child, a daughter named Nanette Dorothea. Both children were given the surname Potthast, their mother's name, to maintain the fiction that Himmler was not their father. Himmler provided generously for Hedwig and their children. He set them up in a villa in Schönau am Königssee, a picturesque area in Bavaria near Hitler's mountain retreat at Berchtesgaden. The location was carefully chosen, close enough that Himmler could visit regularly, but discreet enough to maintain secrecy. He visited them frequently, playing the role of doting father to Helge and Nanette Dorothea, even as he continued his work orchestrating mass murder across Europe. The contradiction was staggering. This man could be tender with his own children, while simultaneously ordering the deaths of hundreds of thousands of other people's children. Hedwig knew exactly who Heinrich Himmler was. She worked as his secretary, handling his correspondence, managing his schedule. She could not have been ignorant of his role in the Third Reich. Yet she chose to be with him, to bear his children, to accept the lavish lifestyle he provided. Whether she shared his ideology or simply closed her eyes to it remains a matter of speculation, but her choices speak to a certain moral flexibility at the very least. When the war ended in May 1945, Hedwig's world collapsed just as thoroughly as Margarete's. She was not Himmler's legal wife, so she had no official standing, no claim to whatever assets might have survived. She was simply a woman with 2 young children, a 3-year-old boy and a 10-month-old baby girl, and a dead lover who happened to be one of the most reviled men in human history. The villa at Schönau was confiscated. The comfortable life was over. Unlike Margarete, who faced legal proceedings and denazification courts, Hedwig largely escaped official scrutiny. She was not a member of the Nazi Party. She had held no official position beyond being Himmler's secretary. The Allied authorities apparently decided she was not worth prosecuting. However, she faced a different kind of punishment. The punishment of living with her choices, of raising 2 children who would eventually learn who their father was, of spending the rest of her life in obscurity and silence. Hedwig adopted a new identity after the war, though the exact details remain murky. She was intensely private, avoiding any contact with journalists, historians, or anyone else who might want to discuss her relationship with Himmler. She raised Helge and Nanette Dorothea away from public attention, in circumstances that were dramatically reduced from their wartime comfort. The children grew up knowing that their father was Heinrich Himmler, but they were taught to keep this information strictly secret. Helge Potthast, Himmler's son, chose a path of complete anonymity. Almost nothing is known about his life after childhood. He never gave interviews, never spoke publicly about his father, and successfully avoided any media attention. It is believed that he changed his name and lived under a different identity, though even this cannot be confirmed with certainty. He wanted no part of his father's legacy, no association with the Himmler name, unlike his half-sister Gudrun, who would spend her entire life defending Heinrich Himmler. Helga chose invisibility. Nanette Dorothea Potthast, Himmler's younger daughter with Hedwig, followed a similar path. She too lived in secrecy, changing her identity and avoiding any public acknowledgement of who her father was. There are no confirmed photographs of her as an adult, no interviews, no public records that definitively trace her life. This level of anonymity in the modern age is remarkable and speaks to a deliberate, sustained effort to disappear from historical view. Hedwig Potthast herself lived until 1994, dying at the age of 82. She spent nearly half a century after Himmler's death, 5 decades during which she never once spoke publicly about her relationship with him or about raising his children. She took her secrets to the grave. No memoir, no confession, no attempt to explain or justify her choices. In her silence, she differed dramatically from some other women connected to Nazi leaders who wrote books, gave interviews, or sought to rehabilitate their loved ones' reputations. Hedwig simply vanished into private life and stayed there. The contrast between Margarete and Hedwig is striking. Margarete, the legal wife, faced denazification proceedings and lived out her years under a false name in relative poverty. Hedwig, the mistress, largely escaped official consequences but chose a life of even deeper obscurity. Both women spent decades hiding from their connection to Heinrich Himmler, but for different reasons and with different outcomes. Both raised children who bore the burden of being Himmler's offspring, but those children made radically different choices about how to handle that burden. Which brings us to the most controversial figure in this story, Gudrun Himmler, the daughter who never stopped defending her father. Gudrun Margarete Elfriede Emma Anna Himmler was born on August 8, 1929, in Munich. She was Heinrich Himmler's only legitimate child, born to him and Margarete when he was just beginning his ascent to power within the Nazi Party. From the very beginning, Heinrich Himmler displayed a special fondness for his daughter that bordered on obsession. He called her by the affectionate nickname Püppi, which roughly translates to little doll. This pet name would remain his term of endearment for her throughout his life. Himmler's devotion to Gudrun was extraordinary, especially for a man of his position and responsibilities. Despite commanding the entire SS apparatus and overseeing the implementation of the Holocaust, he made time for his daughter in ways that seem almost incomprehensible given the nature of his work. He ensured that she was regularly flown from their residence in Munich to his offices in Berlin, an expensive and logistically complex arrangement that demonstrated how important she was to him. When she was at home in Munich with her mother, he maintained close contact with daily phone calls. When his schedule prevented phone conversations, he sent weekly letters, keeping her updated on his life, or at least a sanitized version of it. Gudrun also joined her father during certain official functions, appearing at Nazi party rallies and other events. There are photographs of young Gudrun with her father at various Nazi gatherings, images that would later become deeply uncomfortable given what we now know about Himmler's crimes. To Gudrun, these were simply occasions to spend time with her beloved father, moments of pride at being included in his important work. She had no understanding of what that work truly entailed. What made Gudrun's devotion to her father so remarkable was not just its intensity, but its persistence across decades of overwhelming contradictory evidence. From the moment Allied forces began liberating concentration camps in 1945, the world was confronted with photographic and film evidence of Nazi atrocities. Images of emaciated prisoners, piles of corpses, gas chambers and crematoria shocked the global conscience. Survivors gave testimony about the systematic murder they had witnessed and experienced. Documents captured from Nazi archives detailed the planning and implementation of the final solution with bureaucratic precision. Gudrun had access to all of this evidence. As an educated woman living in Germany, she could read the newspaper accounts of the Nuremberg trials, where Nazi leaders were convicted based on extensive documentation of their crimes. She could visit the memorial sites that were established at former concentration camps. She could read the scholarly histories written about the Holocaust by respected historians. She could watch the documentary films that showed the liberation of the camps. Yet none of this moved her from her position that her father had been wrongly maligned. Her involvement with Stille Hilfe went beyond mere administration or passive support. Gudrun was actively involved in specific cases, helping individual SS veterans avoid justice. One particularly notable case involved Adolf Eichmann, one of the primary organizers of the Holocaust. Although Eichmann was captured in Argentina in 1960 and brought to trial in Jerusalem, where he was convicted and executed in 1962, Stille Hilfe had previously provided support to his family while he was in hiding. Gudrun was part of the network that helped sustain fugitive Nazis and their families during their years on the run. Another significant case involved Klaas Karel Faber, whom we mentioned earlier. Faber was a Dutch SS member who had participated in the murder of dozens of Dutch resistance fighters and civilians. He was convicted by a Dutch court and sentenced to death, a sentence later commuted to life imprisonment. In 1952, he escaped from prison and fled to Germany. For the next 6 decades, he lived openly in Germany under his real name, protected by German authorities who refused Dutch extradition requests on technical legal grounds. Stille Hilfe, with Gudrun playing a key role, provided Faber with legal assistance and financial support throughout this period. They helped him appeal Denazification rulings, navigate the German legal system, and fight extradition attempts. When the Netherlands repeatedly requested his return to serve his sentence, Stille Hilfe lobbied German officials to refuse. Gudrun personally attended court, hearings in support of Faber, sitting in the courtroom as a show of solidarity with the convicted murderer. The organization also helped Aribert Heim, known as Dr. Death, who performed horrific medical experiments on concentration camp prisoners at Mauthausen. Heim fled to Egypt in the 1960s and lived there under an assumed name until his death in 1992. During his decades as a fugitive, Stille Hilfe helped funnel money to him and provided support to his family members who remained in Europe. Gudrun was aware of and approved these activities, seeing them as supporting a persecuted comrade rather than harbouring a war criminal. The scope of Stille Hilfe's activities was extensive. The organization maintained a network across Germany and in several other countries. They provided legal defense funds for SS veterans facing war crimes trials. They organized social events and reunions where former SS members could gather and reminisce about their service. They published newsletters and maintained mailing lists, creating a community of support for unrepentant Nazis. Gudrun attended these reunions regularly, often serving as the guest of honor. These events typically took place in private halls or restaurants, rented under innocuous names to avoid attracting attention or protest. Attendees included men convicted of participating in massacres, running concentration camps, and committing atrocities across occupied Europe. They shared stories, sang old SS songs, and expressed nostalgia for the Third Reich. At these gatherings, Gudrun was treated with reverence. She was the daughter, the living link to Heinrich Himmler, one of the most powerful figures of the Nazi regime. Old men would approach her to shake her hand, to thank her for her loyalty, to tell her stories about serving under her father's command. She accepted these tributes graciously, reinforcing their belief that they had nothing to be ashamed of, that they had simply been soldiers doing their duty. The German Domestic Intelligence Service, the Bundesamt für Verfassungsschutz, monitored these activities for decades. They kept files on Gudrun and other members of Stille Hilfe, tracking their meetings, documenting their attendees, and investigating their connections to neo-Nazi groups. However, German law protected freedom of association, and as long as Stille Hilfe did not engage in explicitly illegal activities like violence or direct Holocaust denial, authorities could not shut down the organization. This created a troubling situation where a group dedicated to supporting convicted war criminals could operate openly in post-war Germany. Critics argued that Stille Hilfe's very existence was an insult to Holocaust survivors and a stain on Germany's efforts to confront its Nazi past. Defenders, mostly from far-right circles, claimed the organization was simply helping elderly veterans who had been unjustly persecuted for following orders during wartime. Gudrun's public statements, though rare, consistently reflected these defensive positions. In a 1999 interview with a Swedish newspaper, she said of her father, "He was a very good father. He was kind and gentle. What they say about the concentration camps, we don't know anything about that." This statement, made more than 50 years after the war ended and after decades of exhaustive historical documentation of the Holocaust, demonstrated her willful commitment to denial. She also stated in various interviews over the years that she believed the Holocaust had been exaggerated, that her father had been trying to protect Germany, and that the Nuremberg trials had been victor's justice rather than legitimate legal proceedings. These views aligned her closely with Holocaust deniers and neo-Nazi revisionists, though she was careful not to explicitly deny the Holocaust in ways that would violate German law. The psychological mechanisms that allowed Gudrun to maintain these beliefs are complex, cognitive. Dissonance theory suggests that when people hold two contradictory beliefs, they experience psychological discomfort and are motivated to resolve the contradiction. For Gudrun, the contradiction was between her loving memories of her father and the historical evidence of his crimes. Rather than accepting that both could be true, that Heinrich Himmler could have been a loving father to her while simultaneously orchestrating genocide, she resolved the dissonance by rejecting the historical evidence. This is a form of motivated reasoning where people evaluate evidence in ways that support their preferred conclusions rather than following the evidence wherever it leads. For Gudrun, the preferred conclusion was that her father was a good man. Any evidence that contradicted this conclusion was therefore suspect, regardless of its strength or source. This allowed her to dismiss survivor testimony as lies, documentary evidence as forgeries, and scholarly consensus as propaganda. Her case also illustrates the powerful role of childhood attachment in shaping adult beliefs and values. The bond formed between Gudrun and her father during her formative years was so strong that it apparently immunized her against any later information that might tarnish his image. Psychologists who study attachment note that children's relationships with their primary caregivers create templates for understanding the world. For Gudrun, the template established in childhood, father as protector, father as loving, father as good, persisted throughout her life, resistant to modification by external evidence. There is also the factor of social reinforcement. Throughout her adult life, Gudrun surrounded herself primarily with people who shared her views. Other children of Nazi leaders who defended their parents, unrepentant SS veterans, neo-Nazi sympathizers, and far-right activists. These social circles provided constant reinforcement for her beliefs and shielded her from serious challenges. To her worldview, when everyone around you believes the same thing, it becomes much easier to maintain beliefs that the broader society rejects. The question of whether Gudrun's beliefs constituted a form of mental illness or delusion has been debated. Most psychologists would argue that they do not, because her beliefs, while false, were not bizarre or incomprehensible. Many people in post-war Germany, particularly among the older generation, harbored similar views in less extreme forms. Gudrun's beliefs were coherent within their own internal logic, even if that logic was built on false premises. This makes them perhaps more disturbing than if they were simply the product of mental illness. They represent a conscious, sustained choice to reject reality in favor of a comforting fiction. Her dedication to this fiction came at significant personal cost. She never married, never had children of her own. She lived a relatively solitary life centered on her mission to preserve her father's memory. She had few close relationships outside of the neo-Nazi circles she moved in. She was reviled by mainstream society and could not appear in public without facing condemnation. Was this sacrifice worth it? From her perspective, apparently yes. Preserving her father's memory was worth any personal price. This brings us to another troubling aspect of Gudrun's story, the support she received from certain segments of German society. While she was condemned by the majority, there was always a minority that admired her loyalty and courage in defending her father. Far-right political parties, neo-Nazi organizations, and revisionist historians treated her as a heroine, someone who refused to bow to political correctness or Allied propaganda. These groups provided Gudrun with validation and support that reinforced her beliefs. They told her she was right to defend her father, that the Holocaust had indeed been exaggerated, that the post-war narrative was a fabrication designed to demonize Germany. They published her statements in their newsletters and websites. They invited her to speak at their events. They created an alternative reality where Gudrun was not a deluded woman defending a mass murderer, but a brave truth-teller standing against historical lies. The internet age amplified this dynamic. In the 1990s and 2000s, as Holocaust denial and Nazi apologetics found new platforms online, Gudrun became something of an icon for these movements. Her photographs appeared on neo-Nazi websites. Her statements were quoted and shared. Her unwavering defense of Heinrich Himmler was held up as an example of loyalty and resistance to the official narrative. She became, in effect, a symbolic figure for those who wished to rehabilitate the Nazi regime. German authorities faced a dilemma with Gudrun. On one hand, her activities clearly supported and encouraged Nazi ideology, something Germany had worked hard to suppress in the post-war period. On the other hand, she was careful not to cross legal lines. She did not explicitly deny the Holocaust in ways that would violate Section 130 of the German Criminal Code, which prohibits incitement to hatred and Holocaust denial. She claimed she simply had questions about the extent of Nazi crimes and was defending her father's memory, which was not illegal. Attempts to restrict her activities ran into problems of freedom of speech and association. Could the government prohibit her from attending reunions of SS veterans? Could they prevent her from supporting an organization that provided legal aid to former Nazis? These questions touched on fundamental civil liberties, and German courts were reluctant to set precedents that might be used to suppress legitimate political speech in other contexts. As a result, Gudrun was able to continue her activities largely unimpeded for decades. She was monitored, documented, and condemned in the press, but not prosecuted or legally restricted. This created a situation where one of the most prominent defenders of Nazi war criminals could operate openly in a democratic society committed to confronting its Nazi past. The relationship between Gudrun and her father existed in a strange bubble, insulated from the horrors happening all around them. While Heinrich Himmler spent his days planning deportations, overseeing concentration camps, and coordinating mass executions, he came home to play the role of doting father. He brought Gudrun gifts, told her stories, and created a fantasy world where he was simply a dedicated German patriot serving his country. She adored him completely, unconditionally, in the way that children love their parents before they understand the complexities of the world. This sheltered existence could not last forever. As the war turned against Germany in its final years, the comfortable life Gudrun had known began to crumble. By early 1945, it was clear to most observers that the Third Reich was doomed. Allied forces were closing in from both east and west. The systematic murder of Europe's Jews, which Himmler had orchestrated so meticulously, was being exposed to the world as concentration camps were liberated. The evidence of Nazi crimes was mounting, and there would be no escaping justice for the architects of these atrocities. In April 1945, Heinrich Himmler made what would be his final visit to see Gudrun and her mother. He spent time with his daughter, though what they discussed during those last conversations is not recorded. Did he try to explain to the 15-year-old girl what was about to happen? Did he maintain the fiction that Germany might still prevail? Or did he simply try to memorize her face, knowing he would never see her again? Whatever passed between them, it was their goodbye, though Gudrun may not have fully understood that at the time. When news of Heinrich Himmler's suicide reached Gudrun on May 23, 1945, she was devastated. Her father, her puppies devoted parent, was dead. But the circumstances of his death immediately became a point of contention for Gudrun. The official account stated that Himmler had bitten into a hidden cyanide capsule while in British custody, choosing death over facing trial for his crimes. Gudrun, however, would spend the rest of her life contesting this version of events. She insisted, without credible evidence, that her father had been assassinated by his British captors. This belief, or perhaps this need to believe, would become one of the defining features of her approach to her father's legacy. Following the war's end, both Gudrun and her mother Margarete were apprehended by American forces. They were detained in a series of internment camps located in Italy, France, and Germany. These were not concentration camps. They were facilities where the families of high-ranking Nazis were held, while Allied authorities determined what, if any, crimes they might have committed. For Gudrun, now a teenager, this must have been a bewildering and frightening experience. She went from being the privileged daughter of one of the Reich's most powerful men to being a prisoner, moved from camp to camp with no clear understanding of when or if she would be released. In 1946, both Gudrun and Margarete were summoned to Nuremberg to provide testimony at the war crimes trials. These trials were prosecuting the surviving leadership of Nazi Germany for crimes against humanity, war crimes, and genocide. Heinrich Himmler would have been one of the primary defendants had he lived, likely facing the death penalty alongside men like Hermann Göring and Joachim von Ribbentrop. Instead, his wife and daughter were called to testify about what they knew of his activities. What exactly Gudrun and Margarete said at Nuremberg is not fully documented in public records, but their testimony apparently satisfied the authorities that they bore no direct legal responsibility for Himmler's crimes. In November 1946, they were released from custody. Gudrun was 17 years old, her formative years shaped by Nazi ideology, wartime privilege, and now imprisonment and interrogation. Most young people in such circumstances might have wanted to distance themselves from their father's legacy, to build a new identity separate from his crimes. Gudrun chose the opposite path. Throughout her life, which would span another 72 years after her father's death, Gudrun worked diligently to preserve her father's image and memory. She never wavered in her conviction that Heinrich Himmler had been a good man who loved his family and served Germany honorably. The overwhelming evidence of his role in the Holocaust, the millions of deaths he ordered, the systematic torture and murder he oversaw, none of it changed her mind. This was not ignorance. As an adult, Gudrun had access to all the historical documentation, all the testimony from survivors, all the evidence from the trials. She chose not to accept it. Gudrun became an integral part of Stille Hilfe, which translates to silent aid or silent help. This was a secretive organization established in 1951 by Princess Helene Elisabeth von Eisenburg, herself a Nazi sympathizer. The organization's stated purpose was to provide support to arrested, condemned, or fugitive former SS members. In practice, this meant helping Nazi war criminals evade justice, providing them with legal assistance, financial support, and in some cases, helping them flee to countries like Argentina, Chile, or Paraguay that were willing to harbour them. Gudrun's involvement with Stille Hilfe was extensive and long-lasting. She served in various leadership roles within the organization for decades. Under her guidance, the group helped numerous convicted war criminals, including Klaus Barbie, the Butcher of Lyon, and Aribert Heim, known as Dr. Death for his sadistic medical experiments on prisoners. The organization provided legal defense funds, assisted families of imprisoned SS members, and worked to glorify the Waffen-SS as honorable soldiers, rather than the perpetrators of genocide they actually were. This was not passive support or quiet sympathy. Gudrun actively championed the cause of SS veterans, attending their reunions, speaking at their gatherings, and working to rehabilitate their image in the public eye. She argued that the SS had been unfairly demonized, that her father and his men were simply soldiers following orders, and that the Holocaust had been exaggerated or misunderstood. These positions put her at odds with mainstream historical understanding and with the survivors of Nazi atrocities. Gudrun's unwavering loyalty to her father's legacy was evident in everything she did. She collected and preserved his personal papers, photographs, and memorabilia. She maintained relationships with other children of high-ranking Nazis who shared her revisionist views. She gave occasional interviews to far-right publications, always defending her father, always insisting on his innocence. When mainstream media requested interviews, she typically refused, knowing that they would not present her father in the sympathetic light she desired. Her dedication to this cause was such that it defined her entire adult life. She never married, never had children of her own. She lived modestly in a small apartment in Munich, not far from where she had grown up. The luxurious lifestyle of her childhood was long gone, but she seemed unconcerned with material comfort. Her mission was preserving her father's memory and supporting his former comrades, and she pursued this mission with single-minded determination. In 1951, when Gudrun was 22 years old, she faced a moment that might have shaken her resolve. That year, Rudolf Höss, the commandant of Auschwitz, was executed for his crimes. Höss had worked directly under Heinrich Himmler's command. He had testified extensively about the Holocaust, about the gas chambers, about the systematic murder of Jews, Roma, homosexuals, political prisoners, and others deemed undesirable by the Nazi regime. He provided detailed accounts that directly implicated Himmler in these crimes. Gudrun could have read his testimony. She could have confronted the evidence. She chose instead to dismiss it as lies, as Allied propaganda. As the decades passed, more and more evidence of Nazi crimes came to light. Archives were opened, survivors told their stories, historians documented the Holocaust in painstaking detail. The Eichmann trial in 1961 brought renewed international attention to the systematic nature of the genocide. The Frankfurt Auschwitz trials of 1963 to 1965 put concentration camp personnel on trial and exposed their crimes to public scrutiny. Through all of this, Gudrun remained unmoved. Her father, she insisted, had been a victim of slander and Allied propaganda. In the 1960s and 1970s, as Germany grappled with its Nazi past and a new generation questioned their parents and grandparents about what they had done during the war, Gudrun stood apart. While some children of Nazi leaders, like Niklas Frank, publicly denounced their father's crimes, Gudrun did the opposite. She became more entrenched in her position, more vocal in her defense. She associated primarily with other unrepentant Nazis and their families, creating an insular community that reinforced their shared denial of historical reality. One particularly revealing episode occurred in the 1970s when Gudrun was contacted by a Jewish woman whose family had been murdered at Auschwitz. The woman wanted to understand how Gudrun could defend her father knowing what he had done. She hoped for some sign of remorse, some acknowledgement of the suffering Himmler had caused. The meeting did not go as the survivor hoped. Gudrun expressed no regret, no sympathy. She insisted her father had been a good man and that the stories about the Holocaust were exaggerated. The survivor left the meeting deeply disturbed by Gudrun's complete lack of empathy. This incident reveals something crucial about Gudrun's psychology. This was not simple denial or an inability to face painful truths. This was an active, conscious choice to reject reality in favor of preserving her image of her father. She valued her childhood memories of Pupi and her loving papa more than she valued truth or justice or the suffering of millions of people. It was a form of moral narcissism. Her feelings, her needs, her desire to remember her father fondly took precedence over everything else. By the 1980s, Gudrun had become something of a figure of fascination for both mainstream journalists and far-right groups. The former wanted to understand her psychology, to explore how someone could so thoroughly deny historical fact. The latter celebrated her as a symbol of unwavering loyalty, a woman who refused to betray her father's memory despite overwhelming social pressure. Neo-Nazi groups particularly admired her, seeing her as a living link to the Third Reich and a model of devotion to the cause. In 1996, investigative journalists discovered that Stille Hilfe had been helping Klaas Karel Faber, a Dutch SS member convicted of multiple murders, evade extradition to the Netherlands. Faber had escaped from prison in 1952 and fled to Germany, where he lived under his own name, protected by German authorities' refusal to extradite him. Stille Hilfe, with Gudrun's involvement, provided him legal and financial support. When this became public, there was international outcry, but Gudrun was unapologetic. From her perspective, she was helping a persecuted veteran, not harbouring a murderer. Throughout the 1990s and into the 21st century, Gudrun continued her work with Stille Hilfe, even as she aged. She attended SS veterans reunions well into her 70s and 80s, often being the guest of honour at these gatherings. Old men, many of them convicted war criminals or participants in atrocities, would embrace her, call her the daughter, and thank her for her loyalty. These events were held quietly, away from media attention, in private halls rented under false pretenses. German authorities monitored these gatherings and monitored Gudrun's activities. In 2013, when she was 84 years old, she attended a gathering in Bad Nendorf, where several convicted war criminals were present. One of them was Samuel Kunz, who had participated in mass shootings of Jews in Poland. Another was Helmut Oberlander, accused of being part of a death squad that murdered tens of thousands of people. Gudrun saw no problem socializing with these men. To her, they were her father's comrades, deserving of respect and support. This pattern continued until the very end of her life. Gudrun Himmler died on May 24, 2018, at the age of 88. She died in Munich, not far from where she was born, 88 years earlier. She had outlived her father by 73 years, and in all that time she never once publicly acknowledged the truth about what he had done. She never expressed remorse for the millions who died because of his orders. She never showed empathy for the survivors or their families. She remained, until her last breath, her father's most devoted defender. The question that haunts anyone who studies Gudrun Himmler is, how? How could an intelligent woman, and by all accounts she was intelligent, maintain such denial in the face of overwhelming evidence? Psychologists have suggested several possible explanations. One is that her identity became so wrapped up in being Heinrich Himmler's daughter that accepting the truth about him would have meant a complete psychological collapse. To admit that her father was a monster would be to admit that her entire life had been built on a foundation of evil. Another explanation is that the unconditional love between father and daughter in her childhood created an emotional bond so strong that no amount of evidence could break it. She remembered his tenderness toward her, his phone calls and letters, his affectionate nickname for her. Those memories were real, and they were powerful. The fact that the same man who was gentle with his daughter could orchestrate mass murder required a level of cognitive complexity that perhaps Gudrun could not or would not accept. The denazification process that Margarete Himmler underwent was part of a massive Allied effort to purge Nazi influence from German society after the war. Between 1945 and 1950, over 12 million Germans went through some form of denazification screening. The process involved filling out extensive questionnaires about their activities during the Nazi period, appearing before tribunals, and being classified into one of several categories based on their level of involvement with the regime. The categories ranged from major offenders who faced prison, time and severe restrictions, to followers who might face only minor penalties, to exonerated persons who were cleared of any significant Nazi involvement. Margaret's classification as a profiteer fell somewhere in the middle. It acknowledged that she had benefited from her husband's position without accusing her of directly participating in crimes. The tribunal that reviewed Margaret's case had to weigh several factors. On one hand, she had been married to one of the most powerful and culpable figures in the Nazi regime. She had benefited materially from his position, living in comfortable homes, travelling extensively, and enjoying a privileged lifestyle. She had been a member of the Nazi Party since 1928 and had organised events for the wives of SS leaders. Her diary entries from occupied Poland demonstrated clear anti-Semitic views and awareness of the harsh conditions imposed on occupied populations. On the other hand, there was no evidence that Margaret had directly participated in violence or persecution. She was not a member of the SS herself. She had not worked in concentration camps or participated in deportations. Her role in the German Red Cross, while politically compromised, was ostensibly humanitarian. The question was whether being married to Heinrich Himmler and supporting the regime constituted sufficient culpability to warrant serious punishment. The tribunal heard testimony about Margaret's activities during the war years. Witnesses described her hosting gatherings for Nazi wives, her trips to occupied territories, and her continued expressions of support for National Socialism even late in the war. They also heard about her marital difficulties after discovering Heinrich's affair with Hedwig Potast, which some saw as evidence that she was not completely aligned with her husband in all matters. Margaret herself maintained a careful position during the proceedings. She acknowledged her membership in the Nazi Party, but claimed it was largely a formality required of the wife of a high-ranking official. She admitted to anti-Semitic views, but said they were common in German society at the time and did not make her personally responsible for the Holocaust. She insisted she had no knowledge of the concentration camps or the systematic murder of Jews until after the war ended. This claim of ignorance was difficult to evaluate. How much did Margaret truly know about her husband's activities? Heinrich Himmler was meticulous about operational security and compartmentalization of information. He may well have kept the details of the final solution from his wife, though it seems unlikely he could have completely hidden the nature of his work. Margaret's diary entry from Poland suggests she was aware of harsh treatment of Jewish populations, though it does not prove knowledge of systematic extermination. The tribunal ultimately decided that while Margaret had been complicit in supporting the regime and had profited from its crimes, she had not been a primary perpetrator. The sentence of 30 days of penal labour was relatively light compared to what she might have received. The stripping of voting rights and pension eligibility was meant to ensure she did not materially benefit from her former position while still allowing her to survive. The denazification process itself was controversial and imperfect. Critics noted that many seriously compromised individuals received light sentences or were classified as mere followers, while others who had minor involvement were severely punished. The tribunals were staffed by Germans who had themselves lived through the Nazi period, and accusations of bias and corruption were common. Some tribunals were lenient with former Nazis, while others were harsh. By the early 1950s, the intensity of denazification was waning. The Cold War was heating up, and West Germany was being repositioned as an ally against the Soviet Union. There was pressure to move past the Nazi period and rebuild German society, which meant being lenient with all but the most egregious offenders. This context helps explain why Margaret received a relatively light sentence and was able to live out her life in relative freedom, albeit under a false name. Her decision to adopt the pseudonym Margarete Gudrun was both practical and symbolic. Practically, it allowed her to avoid the constant recognition and harassment that came with being known as Heinrich Himmler's widow. Symbolically, it represented an attempt to return to her pre-Himmler identity, to become again the person she was before she married into infamy. But could she really escape her past so easily? The question haunted Margaret in her remaining years. She lived in modest circumstances, far from the comfortable lifestyle she had enjoyed during the Nazi era. She had few social connections and apparently no close friends. She avoided public spaces where she might be recognized. She never gave interviews, or made public statements about her life with Heinrich Himmler. Some historians have speculated about Margaret's inner thoughts during these years of self-imposed exile. Did she feel guilt for her husband's crimes? Did she regret her involvement with the Nazi Party? Did she mourn the loss of her former life, or was she relieved to escape the scrutiny that came with it? We cannot know, because she left no record of her thoughts and feelings. What we do know is that she maintained contact with her daughter Gudrun, who visited her occasionally. These visits must have been complicated affairs. Gudrun was actively working to defend Heinrich Himmler's legacy, while Margarete was trying to disappear from association with him. Did they argue about this? Did Margarete try to convince Gudrun to let go of her father's memory? Or did she quietly support her daughter's mission while publicly maintaining her anonymity? There is some evidence that Margarete provided Gudrun with some of Heinrich's personal papers and photographs, materials that Gudrun would carefully preserve for decades. This suggests that Margarete had not completely severed her emotional connection to her late husband, despite everything. Perhaps she, like Gudrun, could not entirely reconcile the man she had known personally with the historical monster he had become. The financial situation faced by Margarete after being stripped of her pension was dire. She was in her 60s, had no professional skills or recent work experience, and could not use her real name to seek employment. It is unclear how she supported herself during the final 14 years of her life. She may have received some financial support from relatives or from sympathetic former Nazis, though there is no documented evidence of this. Some accounts suggest she worked menial jobs under her assumed name, perhaps as a cleaning woman or in similar low-wage employment. This would have been a dramatic fall from her previous status. As the wife of the Reichsführer SS, living in comfortable homes and travelling across Europe. If true, it speaks to the complete reversal of fortune that the end of the war brought to Nazi elites and their families. Her death in 1967 passed almost without notice. There was no obituary in major newspapers, no public funeral, no official recognition of her passing. She was buried under her assumed name, and only a small circle of people, presumably including Gudrun, attended her burial. In death, as in her final years, Margarete Himmler had successfully disappeared from history, leaving behind only fragmentary records and unanswered questions. The contrast between Margaret's fate and that of some other Nazi wives is instructive. Emmy Goering, widow of Hermann Goering, wrote a memoir and lived somewhat publicly, albeit in reduced circumstances. Lena Heydrich, widow of Reinhard Heydrich, also wrote a memoir defending her husband and managed to secure a pension through legal action. Ilse Hess, Rudolf Hess's widow, became a public advocate for her imprisoned husband. Margarete chose none of these paths. She neither publicly defended nor condemned her late husband. She neither wrote memoirs nor gave interviews. She neither sought rehabilitation nor additional punishment. She simply tried to disappear, to become someone else, to live out her remaining years as privately as possible. Whether this represented genuine remorse, pragmatic self-preservation, or simply exhaustion with the burden of being Heinrich Himmler's widow, we cannot say with certainty. What is clear is that her story illustrates one of the many ways that the families of Nazi perpetrators dealt with the aftermath of the Third Reich's collapse. For some, like Gudrun, the answer was defiant defense. For others, like Margarete, it was quiet disappearance. Both responses were attempts to cope with an impossible situation, being inextricably connected to one of history's greatest crimes while trying to live a life in the aftermath. The archival records related to Margarete's denazification proceedings remain available to researchers today. They provide a window into the complex process of trying to assign responsibility and mete out justice in the chaotic aftermath of World War II. Reading through these files, one is struck by the difficulty of the task. How do you fairly judge someone for supporting a regime that was so thoroughly evil? How do you distinguish between active participation and passive complicity? How do you balance punishment with practical considerations of allowing society to move forward? These were not abstract questions for the tribunals that handled thousands of cases in the late 1940s. They were immediate practical challenges that required making difficult judgments with incomplete information and under enormous political pressure. Margarete's case was relatively straightforward compared to some. She was clearly associated with the regime through her marriage and her own party membership, but she had not committed specific documented crimes. Yet, the outcome of her case, minimal punishment followed by a life of obscurity and poverty, raises questions about whether justice was truly served. On one hand, she did face consequences: loss of status, loss of income, loss of her name and identity. On the other hand, compared to the millions who died because of the regime she supported, her suffering was minimal. This disparity between the crimes of the Nazi regime and the punishments meted out to all but the top leadership remains a source of ongoing historical debate and moral unease. The question of how Heinrich Himmler managed to maintain two families simultaneously provides fascinating insight into both his personal character and the broader culture of the Nazi elite. The logistical challenges alone were considerable. He had to allocate time between his official duties, his wife and legitimate daughter in one location, and his mistress and illegitimate children in another location. He had to provide financial support to both households. He had to maintain secrecy about the second family to avoid scandal. That he accomplished all of this while simultaneously running the SS apparatus and overseeing the Holocaust speaks to his exceptional organizational abilities. The same abilities that made him so effective at orchestrating mass murder. Himmler approached his personal life with the same bureaucratic efficiency he brought to genocide, carefully compartmentalizing, scheduling, and managing multiple responsibilities simultaneously. The SS culture actively encouraged this kind of behavior. Heinrich Himmler himself had issued policies urging SS men to father as many children as possible, both within and outside of marriage, to increase the Aryan population. He established Lebensborn, a program that provided support for unmarried mothers of racially pure children and facilitated adoptions of such children by approved families. In promoting polygamy, or at least serial procreation among SS officers, Himmler was living out his own ideological principles. There was a peculiar aspect to Nazi ideology around sexuality and reproduction. On one hand, the regime promoted traditional family values, with the nuclear family headed by a married couple as the ideal. On the other hand, the obsession with producing racially pure children led to contradictory policies that encouraged reproduction outside of traditional marriage structures. This contradiction was never fully resolved, leading to situations like Himmler's where high-ranking Nazis maintained both official families and unofficial ones. Hedwig Potthast's acceptance of this arrangement raises questions about her own motivations and psychology. She was an educated, capable woman who could presumably have found a more conventional relationship. Instead, she chose to be the mistress of a married man, knowing she would never be his legal wife, knowing her children would be illegitimate, knowing she would have to live in secrecy. Part of the explanation may be the simple attraction to power and status. Heinrich Himmler was one of the most powerful men in Nazi Germany. Being his consort, even unofficially, brought privileges and protections that few people enjoyed. The villa at Schönau, the financial security, the special treatment, these were significant inducements, especially in a time of war when most Germans faced increasing hardships. But there may have been genuine affection as well. Letters between Himmler and Hedwig, some of which survived and are now in archives, suggest that he expressed tenderness toward her and the children. He visited regularly when his schedule permitted. He took an interest in the children's development. Within the confines of this strange arrangement, there appears to have been something resembling a genuine relationship, however. Morally compromised it was by its context. The children born from this relationship, Helge and Nanette Dorothea, were in many ways born into an impossible situation. They were the secret children of one of history's most notorious criminals, raised during a world war, and then left to navigate the aftermath when their father killed himself and their entire world collapsed. For Helge, born in February 1942, the first 3 years of his life were spent in relative comfort at the villa in Schönau. His father visited regularly, played with him, brought him gifts. He was too young to understand what his father did when he left, too young to comprehend the larger context of the war raging across Europe. His earliest memories, if he retained any from that age, would have been of a loving father figure and a comfortable home. Then, in May 1945, everything changed. Suddenly there were no more visits from father. Suddenly the comfortable life ended. Suddenly he and his mother and baby, sister were displaced, fleeing, trying to avoid capture and scrutiny. For a 3-year-old, this would have been traumatic and bewildering. Where did father go? Why did everything change? These questions, if he could even formulate them at that age, would have no good answers. As Helge grew older and learned the truth about who his father was, he faced unique challenges. Unlike Gudrun, who had her loving memories to cling to, Helge's memories were fragmentary and from such an early age that they could barely be trusted. He could not really remember his father clearly. What he knew of Heinrich Himmler came from his mother's accounts and from history books, and those sources told radically different stories. His mother, Hedwig, apparently tried to maintain some positive memory of Himmler in her children's minds, at least initially. She told them their father had loved them, had provided for them, had been a good man in his private life, even if history judged him harshly. But as Helge grew older and learned more about the Holocaust, about the concentration camps, about the systematic murder of millions, he had to reconcile these accounts with the historical reality. The psychological burden of this must have been immense. Imagine being told as a child that your father was a good man who loved you, then learning as a teenager that he had orchestrated the murder of 6 million Jews and millions of others. How do you process that information? How do you form a coherent sense of identity when your very existence is tied to someone who committed such evil? Helge's response, as far as we know, was to retreat into total privacy. He changed his name, created a new identity, and refused all contact with journalists, historians, or anyone interested in his connection to Heinrich Himmler. This is an understandable survival strategy. By becoming someone else, by severing all visible connection to his father, he could escape the judgment and curiosity that would otherwise have dominated his life. For Nanette Dorothea, born in July 1944, the situation was even more complicated. She was less than a year old when the war ended. She has literally no memories of her father. Everything she knows about Heinrich Himmler comes from external sources. Her mother's stories, historical accounts, the burden of her secret identity. She never experienced any of the benefits that Gudrun enjoyed from having a powerful father. She only inherited the costs. Growing up in post-war Germany with the secret that Heinrich Himmler was your father must have created a peculiar form of isolation. Nanette Dorothea could not talk about her family history with friends. She could not seek counselling or therapy for the psychological burden she carried, because revealing the truth to a therapist risked the secret becoming known. She had to construct a false family narrative and maintain it consistently across all areas of her life. This kind of sustained deception takes a tremendous psychological toll. Research on people who live with significant secrets shows that the cognitive load of maintaining a false narrative can lead to anxiety, depression, and difficulty forming intimate relationships. How can you truly be close to someone if you cannot tell them the truth about who you are? How can you build a life based on lies without feeling fundamentally inauthentic? Yet Nanette Dorothea apparently managed to do so. She built some kind of life for herself, presumably married, perhaps had children of her own. If so, did she tell her husband the truth about her father? Did her children know they were Heinrich Himmler's grandchildren? Or did she maintain the secret across generations, creating multiple layers of deception? These are not merely idle questions. They touch on fundamental issues of identity, honesty, and the ethics of secrecy. Is it morally acceptable to hide such a significant truth from your own children? Or is it justified by the need to protect them from the burden of that knowledge? There are no easy answers, and we do not know what choices Nanette Dorothea made. What we do know is that she has successfully maintained her anonymity for over 80 years. In an age of digital records, DNA databases, and investigative journalism, this is a remarkable achievement. It suggests a level of discipline and determination comparable to that employed by intelligence operatives or witness protection participants. She has lived her entire life as a carefully constructed persona, never once letting the mask slip. The question of whether Helge and Nanette Dorothea ever had contact with their half-sister Gudrun is fascinating to consider. On one level, they shared a father and might have felt some family connection. On another level, they represented completely opposite approaches to Heinrich Himmler's legacy. Gudrun embraced and defended it. Helge and Nanette Dorothea fled from it. This fundamental difference in values and approach would have made any relationship extraordinarily difficult. There is no evidence in the historical record of any contact between Gudrun and her half-siblings. When Gudrun died in 2018, there were no reports of Helge or Nanette Dorothea attending her funeral or making any public acknowledgement of her death. This suggests that they either had no relationship or chose to maintain their anonymity even in the face of family events that might normally bring relatives together. This estrangement, if it existed, represents another casualty of Heinrich Himmler's crimes. 3 siblings who might otherwise have known each other were kept apart by the terrible legacy of their shared father. Gudrun lived openly with the Himmler name while defending her father's reputation. Helga and Nanette Dorothea lived in hiding under false names, trying to escape that same reputation. The gulf between these positions was unbridgeable. The broader Himmler family network extended beyond the immediate family members we have discussed. Heinrich had cousins, nephews, nieces, and more distant relatives, all of whom found themselves tainted by association with him after the war. Some changed their names. Some emigrated to other countries. Some tried to maintain normal lives despite the burden of the family name. One particularly tragic case involves a distant cousin of Heinrich Himmler who was living in the United States when the war ended. This individual, whose specific identity remains unclear in historical records, had emigrated before the war and had no involvement with the Nazi regime. Yet when Heinrich Himmler's name became synonymous with the Holocaust, this person faced harassment and suspicion from neighbours and co-workers. Despite having no connection to Heinrich's crimes, they were judged guilty by association. Eventually, they changed their name and moved to a different state, trying to escape the stigma. This pattern repeated itself across the extended family. People who happened to be born into the Himmler family through no choice of their own found their lives disrupted and damaged by Heinrich's crimes. This raises profound questions about collective guilt and the limits of family responsibility. Should distant relatives of war criminals bear any burden for crimes they did not commit and possibly did not even know about until after the fact? German society struggled with these questions throughout the post-war period. There was a tension between the desire to hold Nazis accountable and the recognition that family members, especially distant ones, often bore no personal responsibility. Denazification tribunals tried to make these distinctions, but the process was imperfect and the outcomes varied widely. The case of Heinrich Himmler's relatives was further complicated by his particular notoriety. If you were a distant relative of a minor Nazi official, you might escape notice entirely. But being related to Heinrich Himmler, even distantly, meant potentially facing scrutiny and judgment. The name itself had become so infamous that it could not be ignored. Some family members dealt with this by embracing the denazification process and actively demonstrating their rejection of Nazi ideology. They cooperated with authorities, testified about what they knew, and made public statements condemning the regime. This strategy worked for some, allowing them to rehabilitate their public image and continue living in Germany. Others chose emigration, leaving Germany entirely to escape the association with their family name. There are Himmler relatives who settled in the United States, Canada, Australia, and South America, starting new lives far from the scenes of their infamous relatives' crimes. Some kept their name, trusting that geographic distance would insulate them from recognition. Others changed their names, creating complete breaks with their past. The question of what responsibility these extended family members bore is complicated by the fact that some of them may have supported the Nazi regime, even if they did not commit specific crimes. Being related to Heinrich Himmler often meant being part of social circles where Nazi ideology was normalized and accepted. Some family members were themselves Nazi party members or beneficiaries of the regime's policies. Distinguishing between genuine ideological commitment and pragmatic accommodation to the prevailing political reality was difficult. Many Germans joined the Nazi Party not out of deep conviction, but because it was necessary for career advancement or social acceptance. For the Himmler relatives, the pressure to join may have been even stronger, given their family connection to one of the regime's leaders. In the decades after the war, German society underwent a gradual and painful process of confronting its Nazi past. This process, known as Vergangenheitsbewältigung, involved education about the Holocaust, memorialization of victims, prosecution of war criminals, and public discussion about how such atrocities could have happened. The Himmler family members living in Germany had to navigate this changing cultural landscape. In the 1950s and 1960s, there was a tendency towards silence and avoidance. Many Germans did not want to talk about the Nazi period, and those with connections to Nazi leaders could often blend into society as long as they kept quiet. But in the 1970s, and especially the 1980s, a new generation began demanding more accountability and transparency. This created additional pressure on anyone connected to the Nazi regime. For the Himmler relatives, Each decade brought new challenges. The Eichmann trial in 1961, the Frankfurt Auschwitz trials in the mid-1960s, the broadcast of the American miniseries Holocaust in Germany in 1979, each of these events renewed public attention to Nazi crimes and, by extension, to the families of perpetrators. Being a Himmler during these periods meant facing renewed scrutiny and judgment. The extended family's experiences also varied by age. Those who were adults during the Nazi period and who may have supported the regime faced harsher judgment than younger family members who were children or not yet born during the war. This created generational divisions within the family, with younger members sometimes condemning the choices made by their elders. These generational conflicts played out in families across Germany, but were particularly acute in families like the Himmlers, where the connection to Nazi crimes was so direct and notorious. Imagine being a teenager in the 1960s and learning that your grandfather's cousin was Heinrich Himmler, architect of the Holocaust. How do you process that information? How does it shape your understanding of your family and yourself? Some younger Himmler family members responded by completely breaking with their elders and embracing a strong anti-Nazi stance. They made public statements condemning their family's connection to the regime. They changed their names. They became active in education about the Holocaust. In doing so, they tried to create some distance between themselves and the crimes their family member had committed. Others took a more ambiguous approach, neither publicly defending nor condemning their infamous relative. They simply tried to live quiet lives, hoping not to attract attention. This middle path was perhaps the most common response among extended family members, a kind of passive disassociation that neither embraced nor actively rejected the family connection. A small minority, like Gudrun, took the opposite approach, defending Heinrich Himmler and maintaining connections with the far-right subculture that celebrated Nazi ideology. For these individuals, family loyalty apparently outweighed moral considerations or historical truth. They saw themselves as upholding family honor in the face of what they viewed as unfair persecution. The dynamics within the Himmler family reflect broader patterns seen in other Nazi families. There are striking parallels with the families of other high-ranking Nazis. Children who defend their fathers despite overwhelming evidence of crimes, siblings who take divergent paths in dealing with family legacy, extended relatives who change their names and disappear. Each family's story is unique in its details but shares common themes of guilt, denial, shame, and the struggle to move forward. One particularly interesting comparative case is that of the Frank family. Hans Frank was the Governor-General of occupied Poland, known as the Butcher of Poland for his role in atrocities there. His son, Nicholas Frank, became one of the most outspoken critics of his father, writing books and giving interviews condemning him. By contrast, Gudrun Himmler became one of the most outspoken defenders of her father. Why did two children of similarly notorious Nazi criminals take such opposite paths? The answer likely lies in a combination of factors: the nature of their relationships with their fathers, their experiences after the war, their personalities, and the social influences they were exposed to. Nicholas Frank was older than Gudrun when his father was executed, and he reportedly had a more conflicted relationship with Hans Frank even before learning the full extent of his crimes. Gudrun, by contrast, adored her father without qualification and apparently never developed the critical distance necessary to judge him objectively. These individual variations in response highlight the complexity of family legacy and moral responsibility. There is no single way that children of war criminals react to their parents' crimes. Some defend, some condemn, some hide, some speak out. Each person must find their own way to live with a burden they did not choose but cannot entirely escape. For the Himmler family, this burden has now extended across 4 generations. The great-grandchildren of Heinrich Himmler, if any exist, would be young adults or middle-aged today in 2026. They would have no personal connection to Heinrich Himmler, no memories, perhaps only vague family stories about a distant relative who was somehow important during World War II. How much should they be expected to carry the weight of his crimes? This question becomes more pressing as we move further from the events of 1933-1945. At some point, the genetic and family connection to perpetrators becomes so attenuated that it seems unreasonable to expect descendants to bear any special burden. But where is that line? Is it 2 generations, 3, 4? When does someone cease to be Heinrich Himmler's descendant in any meaningful sense and become simply an individual person whose great-great-grandfather happened to be a historical figure. The relationship between Heinrich Himmler and his daughter Gudrun was documented in numerous letters that survived the war. These letters reveal a side of Himmler that seems almost incomprehensible when juxtaposed with his role as the architect of genocide. In his correspondence with Gudrun, he was tender, affectionate, and deeply concerned about her welfare. He asked about her schoolwork, her health, her friendships. He sent her gifts and expressed how much he missed her when they were apart. One particularly striking letter, written in 1941 when Gudrun was 12 years old, shows Himmler writing to her about a visit to the Eastern Front. He described the landscape, the weather, and the courage of the German soldiers, framing everything in terms that a child could understand, and that presented the war as a noble endeavour. What he did not mention were the mass shootings of Jews that were occurring in those same areas, often under his direct orders or observation. The ability to maintain this cognitive separation, to be a loving father in one moment and a mass murderer in the next, is one of the most disturbing aspects of Himmler's character. This duality is not unique to Himmler. Many Nazi perpetrators led seemingly normal personal lives while committing atrocities professionally. Rudolf Höss, the commandant of Auschwitz, lived with his wife and children in a villa adjacent to the camp and reportedly played with his children in a garden where the smoke from the crematoriums was visible. Josef Mengele, the doctor who performed horrific experiments on prisoners, was described by some who knew him personally as charming and friendly. This capacity for compartmentalization is one of the most chilling aspects of Nazi perpetrators. For Gudrun, receiving these affectionate letters from her father would have reinforced her image of him as a good man. She treasured these letters throughout her life, keeping them carefully preserved in her apartment in Munich. When researchers gained access to some of these materials after her death, they provided valuable historical evidence about Himmler's personal life, but they also deepened the mystery of how someone could be so bifurcated in their behavior and values. The psychological phenomenon of compartmentalization helps explain how perpetrators like Himmler could function, but it doesn't fully explain how their family members processed this information after the war. Gudrun read the affectionate letters from her father, but she also had access to historical documentation of his crimes. How did she reconcile these contradictory images? The answer seems to be that she simply rejected the latter as false, choosing to believe in the loving father rather than the genocidal bureaucrat. This selective acceptance of evidence is a form of motivated reasoning that extends beyond simple denial. Gudrun did not merely reject evidence she found uncomfortable, she actively sought out alternative explanations and counter-narratives that supported her preferred conclusion. She read revisionist histories that minimized Nazi crimes. She associated with people who shared her beliefs. She interpreted ambiguous evidence in the most favorable light possible. In doing so, she constructed an alternative reality in which her father was a misunderstood patriot rather than a war criminal. The support system that enabled Gudrun to maintain this alternative reality was provided primarily by Stille Hilfe and the broader network of unrepentant Nazis and their sympathizers. This network operated as a kind of echo chamber where members reinforced each other's beliefs and shielded themselves from contradictory information. Within this community, Gudrun was not a deluded woman defending the indefensible. She was a heroine maintaining family loyalty in the face of Allied propaganda. The funding for Stille Hilfe's activities came from various sources, including membership dues, donations from wealthy sympathizers, and possibly some funds that had been hidden or transferred out of Germany during or after the war. The organization was relatively small and operated on a modest budget, but it was effective within its niche of supporting former SS members and their families. Gudrun's work with the organization was mostly voluntary, though she may have received some compensation for her time and effort. The legal battles that Stille Hilfe fought on behalf of former SS members often centered on pension rights and residency issues. Many former SS members had their pensions revoked or reduced as part of Denazification, and they fought legal battles to restore these benefits. Stille Hilfe provided legal representation and financial support for these cases. They argued that SS membership should not automatically disqualify someone from pension benefits earned through other forms of government service. These legal arguments were often technically correct but morally dubious. The SS was not a conventional military organization. It was the primary instrument of the Holocaust and other Nazi atrocities. Its members volunteered for service knowing the organization's ideology and purpose. Yet German law had to balance retrospective justice with basic fairness, and not every SS member had personally committed crimes that could be proven in court. This created legal grey areas that organisations like Stille Hilfe exploited. Gudrun's personal finances are not well documented, but it appears she lived modestly in her later years. She never married, which means she had no spousal income or support. She worked various jobs earlier in her life, though the details are unclear. She apparently received some form of pension or social support in her old age, though whether this was standard German social security or came from other sources is uncertain. Her lifestyle in her final decades was simple: a small apartment in Munich, few material possessions, her time devoted mainly to her work with Stille Hilfe. This modest lifestyle stands in stark contrast to the lavish circumstances of her childhood, when she was the pampered daughter of one of the Third Reich's most powerful figures. The economic consequences of her father's death and the collapse of the regime were severe for Gudrun, as they were for Margarete and most other families of Nazi elites. The wealth and privilege they had enjoyed evaporated almost overnight, and they had to adapt to dramatically reduced circumstances. Yet Gudrun apparently never expressed regret about the loss of her privileged position. Her focus was not on material comfort, but on preserving her father's memory and supporting his former comrades. In this sense, her values aligned with the austere, duty-bound ideology of the SS, which officially emphasized service and sacrifice over personal comfort, even if many SS leaders did not live up to these ideals in practice. The question of whether Gudrun ever wavered in her beliefs, whether she ever privately doubted her defense of her father, is one we cannot answer definitively. The public record shows unwavering commitment, but what went on in her private thoughts is unknown. Did she have moments of doubt? Did she ever consider that the overwhelming evidence against her father might be true? Did she suffer from cognitive dissonance or psychological distress as a result of her denial? If she did experience such doubts or distress, she never gave any public indication of it. In all her interactions with journalists, in all her work with Stille Hilfe, in all her attendance at SS veterans' reunions, she maintained a consistent position. This suggests either absolute conviction or remarkable discipline in maintaining her public position, regardless of private doubts. Either way, it speaks to a strength of will that is both impressive and disturbing. The impact of Gudrun's advocacy on public discourse about the Holocaust and Nazi crimes is difficult to measure precisely, but was certainly significant. Her very existence as Heinrich Himmler's daughter who defended him provided ammunition for revisionists and deniers. They could point to her and say, even his own daughter doesn't believe the Holocaust happened as described. This was a dishonest argument. Gudrun's beliefs were based on emotional attachment rather than evidence, but it had some persuasive power for those inclined toward denial. Holocaust education specialists have noted that one of the challenges they face is countering the narrative that family members of perpetrators provide. When someone like Gudrun says her father was a good man, it creates cognitive dissonance for people who want to believe that evil people are obviously, visibly evil. The truth that perpetrators can be loving fathers and dutiful sons while also committing monstrous crimes is psychologically uncomfortable, and some people resolve that discomfort by doubting the crimes rather than accepting the complexity. In her final years, as Gudrun aged into her 80s, she became increasingly frail but remained active in Stille Hilfe as long as her health permitted. She attended fewer public events but continued to provide guidance and support to the organisation behind the scenes. When she died in May 2018, just days after the 73rd anniversary of her father's suicide, it marked the end of an era. She was the last of the major Nazi leaders' children who had defended her parents' legacy throughout her entire adult life. Her death occasioned relatively little public comment in mainstream media. Most Germans preferred not to give her additional attention even in death. Far-right publications and websites, however, published tributes celebrating her loyalty and dedication. Some neo-Nazi groups held memorial gatherings in her honour, praising her as a model of filial devotion and ideological commitment. The funeral itself was a small, private affair. Details about who attended and where she was buried have not been made public, likely to prevent her grave from becoming a pilgrimage site for neo-Nazis. This concern was not unfounded. The graves of other Nazi figures, when their locations are known, sometimes attract visitors from far-right movements who leave flowers or other tributes. In the aftermath of Gudrun's death, questions arose about what would happen to her personal collection of her father's materials. She had accumulated letters, photographs, documents, and other memorabilia related to Heinrich Himmler over her lifetime. German authorities ultimately determined that items of historical significance should be preserved in archives where they could be accessed by legitimate researchers while being protected from becoming neo-Nazi relics. This decision reflected the ongoing tension in how to handle Nazi-related artifacts. On one hand, these materials have historical value and can help us understand the perpetrators and their crimes. On the other hand, they can be fetishized by those who celebrate rather than condemn Nazi ideology. Finding the right balance between preservation and prevention of misuse is an ongoing challenge for archivists and museum professionals. The story of Heinrich Himmler's family ultimately illustrates how the effects of historical crimes ripple across generations in unpredictable ways. Margarete tried to disappear and died in obscurity. Gudrun devoted her life to defending her father's memory. Hedwig and her children chose complete anonymity. Heinrich's brothers lived diminished lives under the shadow of his infamy. Extended family members scattered, changed their names, and tried to escape the stigma. Each response was different, but all were shaped fundamentally by Heinrich Himmler's crimes and the burden of being connected to him. As we move further from World War II in time, fewer people have direct personal connections to the perpetrators. The children are mostly gone now, and the grandchildren are aging. Soon, the only living descendants will be great-grandchildren and beyond, people who never knew the perpetrators personally and who have only the most attenuated connection to them. At that point, perhaps the personal burden of family legacy will finally diminish, though the historical legacy will remain forever. The lessons from the Himmler family story extend beyond the specifics of their case. They remind us that evil is not always obvious or easily identifiable, that perpetrators are fully human in all their complexity, that families bear burdens they did not choose, and that confronting historical truth requires courage and honesty that not everyone can muster. These are uncomfortable truths, but understanding them is essential for preventing future atrocities and for dealing justly with their aftermath when prevention fails. There is also a third possibility, one that is perhaps more disturbing. Gudrun may have actually believed in the Nazi ideology herself. She grew up immersed in it, surrounded by it, educated in schools that taught it as truth. The anti-Semitism, the racial theories, the belief in German superiority, these may have been so deeply ingrained in her worldview that she genuinely could not see them as wrong. In this interpretation, Gudrun was not in denial about her father's crimes so much as she was refusing to accept that they were crimes at all. The Holocaust, from this warped perspective, might have been regrettable but necessary, an unfortunate consequence of war and the protection of the German race. This is speculation, as Gudrun never fully articulated her beliefs in public forums where they could be scrutinized, but her associations with neo-Nazi groups and unrepentant war criminals suggest that her views may have aligned with theirs more than she ever admitted. Whatever her motivations, Gudrun's legacy is deeply troubling. She became a symbol for those who want to deny or minimize the Holocaust. She gave comfort and aid to men who had committed terrible crimes. She never acknowledged the suffering of the victims or showed any compassion for those whose lives were destroyed by her father's actions. In her determination to preserve Heinrich Himmler's memory, she caused additional pain to Holocaust survivors and their families, who had to watch her celebrate the man who had tried to exterminate them. Yet in understanding Gudrun, we must also grapple with uncomfortable questions about family loyalty, moral responsibility, and the limits of love. At what point does defending a parent become complicity in their crimes? Is it possible to love someone while also acknowledging the evil they committed? These are questions that extend far beyond the Himmler family and touch on universal human dilemmas. Now let us turn to Heinrich Himmler's brothers, who faced their own reckoning with the family name after the war. Heinrich Himmler had two brothers, Gebhard Ludwig Himmler, who was 3 years older, and Ernst Hermann Himmler, who was 2 years younger. Both men were involved with the Nazi Party, though. Neither achieved anything close to Heinrich's prominence or power. Their stories illustrate how the Himmler name itself became a burden, a mark of shame that affected every member of the family. Gebhard Himmler was born on July 29, 1898, in Munich. He was the eldest of the three brothers and initially pursued a career in engineering. Gebhard joined the Nazi Party in 1933, the same year Hitler came to power. He worked as an engineer and held various administrative positions, but he never joined the SS and never held any significant role in the regime's criminal apparatus. His relationship with his brother Heinrich appears to have been cordial but not particularly close. The letters Margarete wrote to Gebhard, asking him to pass messages to Heinrich, suggest that Gebhard served as something of an intermediary within the family. During the war, Gebhard worked in relative obscurity, far from the centres of Nazi power. He was not involved in the Holocaust, did not participate in war crimes, and by most accounts lived a fairly ordinary life despite his brother's infamy. When the war ended, however, simply being Heinrich Himmler's brother was enough to make him a person of interest to Allied authorities. Gebhard was arrested and interrogated extensively. The Allies wanted to know what he knew about his brother's activities, whether he had benefited from Heinrich's position, and whether he shared Heinrich's ideology. Gebhard insisted that he had no knowledge of the concentration camps or the final solution. He claimed that Heinrich never discussed such matters with him and that they rarely saw each other during the war years. Whether this was entirely true is impossible to verify, but there was no evidence that Gebhard had committed any crimes himself. He was eventually released without charges, but the damage to his life was considerable. His career was over. No one wanted to employ Heinrich Himmler's brother. His social standing evaporated. People who had been friendly before the war now avoided him. He lived out his remaining years in obscurity and relative poverty, dying in 1978 at the age of 79. He never spoke publicly about his brother and apparently tried to live as anonymously as possible. The Himmler name, which Heinrich had made infamous, became Gebhard's curse. Ernst Hermann Himmler, the youngest of the three brothers, had a somewhat different trajectory. Ernst was born on December 23, 1905, also in Munich. Like his brothers, he joined the Nazi Party, becoming a member in 1931. He also joined the SS in 1933, though he never rose to any position of significance. During the war, Ernst worked as a radio technician and broadcaster, producing propaganda programs for the regime. After the war, Ernst was arrested by Allied forces and underwent denazification proceedings. The process examined his involvement with the Nazi Party and the SS to determine what level of responsibility he bore. Ernst was classified as a minor offender, a designation that acknowledged his membership in Nazi organizations but concluded that he had not committed specific crimes. He was subjected to certain restrictions on his employment and political activities, but he was not imprisoned. Ernst attempted to rebuild his life in post-war Germany, but like Gebhard, he found the Himmler name to be an insurmountable obstacle. He worked various jobs, always under a shadow of suspicion and hostility. Some sources suggest that he changed his name to distance himself from his brother's legacy, though this cannot be definitively confirmed. He died in 1985, having lived 4 decades after his infamous brother's suicide, 4 decades during which he could never escape the association with Heinrich Himmler. The Himmler brothers' experiences raise important questions about collective guilt and family responsibility. Neither Gebhard nor Ernst orchestrated the Holocaust. Neither held positions of significant power. Neither, as far as historical records show, committed war crimes themselves. Yet their lives were permanently damaged simply by being Heinrich Himmler's brothers. Is this just? They did join the Nazi Party and the SS, suggesting at least some degree of ideological alignment. They benefited, even if indirectly, from their brother's position, but should they bear lifelong punishment for being related to a monster? These questions become even more complex when we consider Heinrich Himmler's extended family. His wife's relatives, his cousins, his in-laws, all of them found themselves tainted by association. Many changed their names, moved to different cities, created new identities. The ripple effects of Heinrich Himmler's crimes extended far beyond those directly under his command, touching anyone who shared his bloodline or bore his name. One particularly poignant example involves Heinrich Himmler's nephew, also named Heinrich. This younger Heinrich, the son of Gebhard, grew up in the shadow of his infamous uncle. As a child, he was too young to understand what was happening during the war. After the war, as he grew older and learned the truth about Uncle Heinrich, he faced a terrible burden. He shared not just the family name, but the same first name as the architect of the Holocaust. The psychological weight of this was crushing. The younger Heinrich eventually emigrated to another country, changed his name entirely, and cut off all contact with anyone who knew about his family connection. He built a new life, created a new identity, and never spoke about his past. This was a form of self-imposed exile, a necessary severing of all ties to escape the legacy of evil that he had done nothing to create but everything to suffer from. Returning to Hedwig Potthast and her children with Heinrich Himmler, we find another layer of complexity to this family story. Helga and Nanette Dorothea, born in 1942 and 1944 respectively, were the children of Heinrich Himmler's secret relationship with his mistress. Unlike Gudrun, who grew up with her father present and developed that powerful emotional bond, Helga and Nanette Dorothea had a more complicated relationship with their father's memory. They were very young when the war ended. Helga was 3 and Nanette Dorothea was not yet 1 year old. They have no meaningful memories of their father. What they know of Heinrich Himmler comes entirely from what their mother told them and what they learned from history books. This creates a fundamentally different dynamic than Gudrun's situation. For Helga and Nanette Dorothea, Heinrich Himmler was never Papa in any real sense. He was an abstraction, a historical figure, a source of shame rather than cherished memory. Their mother Hedwig made a decision early on that they would live in complete secrecy about their paternity. She impressed upon them the absolute necessity of never revealing who their father was. This was not merely advice, it was a survival strategy. If their true identity became known, they would face harassment, discrimination, possibly violence. They would be unable to build normal lives, so they learned to lie, to create cover stories, to live with a fundamental dishonesty at the core of their existence. Imagine the psychological impact of this. From childhood, Helga and Nanette Dorothea knew they could never tell anyone the truth about who they were. They could not talk about their family history with friends. They had to be constantly vigilant, always afraid that someone might discover their secret. They grew up with a sense of shame about their very existence, through no fault of their own. As adults, both Helga and Nanette Dorothea chose paths of extreme privacy. They changed their names, distanced themselves from their mother's Potthast surname, and created new identities with no connection to Heinrich Himmler. Unlike Gudrun, who embraced her father's legacy, they wanted nothing to do with it. They did not attend SS veterans reunions. They did not join organizations supporting former Nazis. They did not defend their father's actions or deny his crimes. In this sense, Helga and Nanette Dorothea made the opposite choice from their half-sister Gudrun. Where she devoted her life to preserving their father's memory, they devoted their lives to escaping it. This divergence is striking and raises fascinating questions about nature versus nurture, about the role of childhood attachment in shaping adult values, and about the different ways people cope with unbearable legacies. Some historians have speculated about whether Helga and Nanette Dorothea ever attempted to contact Gudrun, their half-sister. There is no evidence that they did. Gudrun certainly knew about them. She would have learned about her father's affair with Hedwig and the existence of her half-siblings. But whether she ever reached out to them, or whether they would have wanted any contact with her, remains unknown. Given their completely different approaches to their shared father's legacy, such a meeting would have been extraordinarily difficult. The choice made by Helga and Nanette Dorothea to live in obscurity stands in stark contrast not only to Gudrun, but also to the children of some other high-ranking Nazis who took a different approach. Consider Niklas Frank, son of Hans Frank, who became a journalist and wrote scathing denunciations of his father, or Rolf Mengele, son of Josef Mengele, who met with his fugitive father in South America and later cooperated with authorities, helping them locate his father's grave. These individuals chose to confront their father's legacies directly, albeit in very different ways. Helga and Nanette Dorothea chose a third path, neither defense nor denunciation, but disappearance. They made themselves invisible to history, removing themselves entirely from the conversation about Nazi legacies and family responsibility. Was this cowardice or wisdom? An evasion of moral responsibility or a legitimate exercise of self-preservation? These are not easy questions to answer. What we know is that their lives were fundamentally shaped by being Heinrich Himmler's children, even though they never really knew him. The accident of their birth determined the course of their entire existence. They were forced to live in hiding, to deny their own history, to construct false identities just to have some semblance of a normal life. In a very real sense, they were victims of their father's crimes, even though they were his children rather than his intended targets. Hedwig Potthast's life after the war becomes even more poignant when we consider the burden she carried. She was not just a woman who had an affair with a powerful man. She chose to have children with Heinrich Himmler, knowing who he was and what he represented. Then she had to raise those children in the aftermath of the Third Reich's collapse, watching them struggle with a legacy of evil that she had helped to create by bringing them into the world. Did Hedwig regret her choices? We cannot know. She left no written record, gave no interviews, made no public statements. But we can imagine the difficulty of her position. If she truly loved Heinrich Himmler, then his death and the exposure of his crimes must have been devastating. If she had simply been attracted to power and luxury, then she got a harsh lesson in the impermanence of such things. Either way, she spent the last 50 years of her life living with the consequences of decisions made in her 20s and 30s, decisions that shaped not only her life but the lives of her children and their descendants. The broader Himmler family network extends beyond just the immediate relatives we have discussed so far. Heinrich Himmler's parents, Gebhard Sr. and Anna Maria Himmler, both died before the full extent of their son's crimes became publicly known. Gebhard Sr. died in 1936 and Anna Maria died in 1941. They were spared the knowledge of what their son had become, though they lived long enough to see him rise to immense power within the Nazi regime. Whether they would have been proud or horrified is a question that can never be answered. Heinrich's father, Gebhard Sr., had been a schoolteacher and later the deputy headmaster of a gymnasium in Munich. He was a strict, conservative Catholic who emphasized discipline, education, and traditional German values. He raised his 3 sons to be upstanding members of society, to respect authority and to serve their country. The irony is profound. This respectable educator, this pillar of the community, raised the man who would become one of history's most notorious criminals. What went wrong? How did Heinrich, raised in a conventional middle-class Catholic household, become the architect of genocide? These questions have occupied historians and psychologists for decades. Some point to the traumatic experience of Germany's defeat in World War I and the humiliation of the Versailles Treaty as formative influences on Heinrich's worldview. Others note his failed military aspirations. He wanted to be a soldier but joined the army too late to see combat in the First World War, a disappointment that may have driven his later militaristic obsessions. Still, others suggest that his father's rigid, authoritarian parenting style created a personality predisposed to embrace totalitarian ideology. Whatever the root causes, the fact remains that Gebhard Sr. and Anna Maria Himmler produced 3 sons who all joined the Nazi Party, with one becoming its second most powerful figure. This raises uncomfortable questions about parental responsibility and the unpredictable outcomes of child rearing. The Himmler parents did nothing overtly wrong in raising their sons, yet the result was catastrophic. It serves as a sobering reminder that good intentions and conventional values are not necessarily safeguards against moral corruption. Moving forward in time, we must consider what happened to the Himmler family legacy in more recent decades. As of today, in 2026, more than 80 years have passed since Heinrich Himmler's death. The direct descendants who knew him personally are either very old or have passed away. Gudrun died in 2018. Helga and Nanette Dorothea's current status is unknown due to their determined privacy, but if they are still alive, they would be in their 80s. But the legacy doesn't end with them. These individuals presumably had children of their own, Heinrich Himmler's grandchildren. What has happened to these third-generation descendants? How do they grapple with being the grandchildren of a mass murderer? Again, we face the challenge of incomplete information because most of them have chosen to live in anonymity. What we do know is that being a descendant of Heinrich Himmler creates unique challenges that persist across generations. In Germany, there is a particular sensitivity around Nazi history. The country has made extensive efforts to confront its past, to educate new generations about the Holocaust, to ensure that such atrocities are never repeated. In this environment, being publicly known as Himmler's grandchild or great-grandchild would be extraordinarily difficult. Some descendants of other Nazi leaders have chosen to speak out publicly. Bettina Göring, the great-niece of Hermann Göring, and her brother voluntarily underwent sterilization to ensure they would not pass on the Göring bloodline. Katrin Himmler, who married an Israeli man whose family members were murdered in the Holocaust, has written about the complexities of her family legacy. Though notably, she is related to Heinrich Himmler through a different branch of the family and is not his direct descendant. The direct descendants of Heinrich Himmler through Gudrun, Helga, and Nanette Dorothea have largely remained silent. This silence is itself a choice, one that deserves respect even as we acknowledge its limitations. They bear no personal responsibility for Heinrich Himmler's crimes, yet they live with the consequences. They face a choice between public acknowledgement, with all the scrutiny and hostility that would entail, or private anonymity, which allows them to live normal lives but also perpetuates a kind of historical erasure. The question of what to do with Heinrich Himmler's physical legacy, his possessions, writings, and the places associated with him, has also been controversial. After the war, many of Himmler's personal papers and documents were seized by Allied forces and eventually made available to historians. These materials have been invaluable in understanding the implementation of the Holocaust and the functioning of the Nazi state. But other items, personal photographs, family mementos, letters to Gudrun, raise more difficult questions. When Gudrun died in 2018, she left behind a collection of her father's personal effects that she had carefully preserved for 73 years. What should happen to these materials? Should they be destroyed to prevent them from becoming neo-Nazi relics? Should they be placed in museums where they can be contextualized historically? Should they remain in private hands, as Gudrun wanted? German authorities ultimately decided that many of these items should be preserved for historical research, though there are strict controls on how they can be accessed and used. The physical sites associated with Heinrich Himmler present similar dilemmas. The villa at Schönau am Königssee, where Hedwig and the children lived, has changed ownership multiple times. The various offices and residences Himmler occupied during his years of power have mostly been repurposed or destroyed. There is no Himmler Museum, no memorial to his life. Instead, the focus has rightly been on memorializing his victims at sites like Dachau, Auschwitz, and the other concentration camps he oversaw. One of the most significant developments in recent decades has been the increased willingness of third-generation descendants of Nazi perpetrators to confront their family histories. Organizations have formed to help these individuals process their complex legacies and to facilitate dialogue between descendants of perpetrators and descendants of victims. These encounters are often deeply emotional and cathartic for both parties. There have been reports, though unconfirmed, that some of Heinrich Himmler's grandchildren have participated in such programs. If true, this would represent a significant break from the family pattern established by Gudrun's denial and Hedwig's children's silence. It would suggest that the third generation is finding new ways to reckon with the past, ways that acknowledge both the crimes that were committed and the human need to understand one's own family history. The psychological literature on descendants of perpetrators has grown considerably in recent years. Researchers have found that the children and grandchildren of Nazi war criminals often suffer from what might be called inherited trauma or secondary victimization. They did not commit the crimes, but they carry the weight of them. They struggle with questions of identity, belonging, and moral responsibility. Many report feelings of shame, guilt, and a sense of being fundamentally damaged by their ancestry. Therapeutic approaches to helping these individuals have evolved. Early post-war attitudes often treated the children of Nazis as potentially dangerous, as though evil might be hereditary. This created additional burdens for people like Gudrun, Helga, and Nanette Dorothea, who were viewed with suspicion simply because of who their father was. More recent approaches recognize that these individuals are not responsible for their parents' or grandparents' crimes, and that they deserve support in processing their complex family histories. The contrast between Gudrun's path and that chosen by her half-siblings remains one of the most fascinating aspects of the Himmler family story. What accounts for such radically different responses to the same father? Part of the answer surely lies in the different relationships they had with Heinrich Himmler. Gudrun knew him, loved him, built her entire childhood identity around being his daughter. Helga and Nanette Dorothea never had that opportunity or burden, depending on how you view it. But there may also be deeper psychological factors at play. Some research suggests that denial and defensiveness, like Gudrun exhibited, can be a form of psychological self-protection. If Gudrun had acknowledged the truth about her father, she would have had to confront the fact that the most important person in her childhood, the person who loved her most unconditionally, was also a mass murderer. That cognitive dissonance might have been too much to bear. Better to reject the evidence, dismiss the witnesses, and maintain the comforting fiction of the good father. Helga and Nanette Dorothea, by contrast, never had that positive father figure to protect. They could afford to accept the historical truth because it did not contradict their personal experience. Their tragedy was different, not the loss of an idealized parent, but the burden of being connected to someone they never knew, but whose crimes defined their lives anyway. As we approach the end of this exploration, it is worth considering what the Himmler family story tells us about guilt, responsibility, and the limits of family loyalty. Should Margarete have done more to distance herself from her husband's crimes? Should Gudrun have accepted the truth about her father instead of spending her life in denial? Should Helga and Nanette Dorothea have spoken out instead of disappearing into anonymity? These are questions each person must answer for themselves, but they are not simple questions. The philosopher Karl Jaspers, writing about German guilt after World War II, distinguished between several types of guilt: criminal guilt for actual crimes committed, political guilt for the actions of one's government, moral guilt for acts of omission or complicity, and metaphysical guilt, a kind of existential responsibility that comes from being part of the human community where such horrors occurred. By this framework, Heinrich Himmler bore criminal guilt of the highest order. His wife Margarete and daughter Gudrun bore at minimum moral guilt for their support of the regime and their refusal to acknowledge its crimes. But what about Helga and Nanette Dorothea, who were infants when the war ended? What about Heinrich Himmler's grandchildren, who were born decades after his death? What about those living today who discover they are distantly related to him? At what point does family connections cease to carry any moral weight? These are not just academic questions. They affect real people trying to build real lives while carrying the burden of a terrible history. The Himmler family story also illuminates the long shadow cast by the Holocaust. We often focus rightly on the victims and survivors, the 6 million Jews murdered, the Roma, the disabled, the political prisoners, the homosexuals, and others targeted by the Nazi regime. But the Holocaust also created a different kind of victim in subsequent generations, the descendants of perpetrators who must live with a legacy of evil they did not create. This does not equate their suffering with that of the victims. There is no comparison. But it does acknowledge that the ripple effects of genocide extend in unexpected directions. Consider the practical implications of being Heinrich Himmler's descendant today. You must constantly evaluate who you tell about your family history. Telling no one means living with a secret that isolates you from genuine intimacy. Telling even close friends risks rejection, judgment, or having your entire identity reduced to this one. Fact about your ancestry. Romantic relationships become particularly fraught. At what point do you reveal this information to a potential partner? How do you know if someone can handle it? Professional life presents additional challenges. In Germany, there are laws against Holocaust denial and Nazi symbolism. While these laws do not prohibit being related to a Nazi, being publicly known as Heinrich Himmler's descendant could affect your career prospects, your social standing, your children's experiences at school. This is why so many descendants choose anonymity. It is simply easier to live as someone else than to constantly navigate the complexities of being associated with genocidal crimes. Yet there is also an argument that descendants of perpetrators have a special responsibility to speak out, to bear witness to what their ancestors did, and to ensure that such crimes are not repeated. Some have embraced this role, becoming educators, advocates for Holocaust remembrance, and voices of conscience. They argue that their family connection gives them unique credibility and that they can reach people who might dismiss the same message from others. The tension between privacy and public responsibility has defined the Himmler family's post-war experience. Margarete chose privacy and died in obscurity. Gudrun chose a kind of twisted public engagement, defending her father and supporting his former comrades. Hedwig and her children chose absolute privacy, disappearing so thoroughly that even historians struggle to trace their lives. Each choice had consequences, both for the individuals making them and for the broader project of coming to terms with Nazi crimes. As we move further from World War II in time, the number of people with direct connections to Nazi perpetrators naturally diminishes. Heinrich Himmler's great-grandchildren, if they exist, have no living memory of him or the war. For them, he is purely a historical figure, albeit one they happen to be related to. Does this genetic connection still matter? Should it affect how they see themselves or how others see them? These questions become particularly relevant in an era of genealogical testing and online databases. It is now possible for someone to discover through DNA testing that they are descended from a Nazi war criminal. This has already happened to some people, creating identity crises and forcing them to confront family secrets they never knew existed. The Himmler family's strategy of secrecy and name changes may be harder to maintain in this new technological landscape. The ultimate question raised by the Himmler family story is about the nature of evil itself. Heinrich Himmler was not born a monster. He was a middle-class boy from Munich, raised by loving parents, educated in good schools, yet he became one of history's most prolific mass murderers. His family members, his wife, daughter, brothers, extended relatives, were ordinary people who found themselves connected to extraordinary evil. How they dealt with that connection reveals much about human psychology, about moral responsibility, and about the long-term consequences of historical atrocities. More than 8 decades after Heinrich Himmler's death, the family members most closely connected to him have all either passed away or disappeared from public view. Margarete died in 1967, taking her secrets with her. Gudrun died in 2018, still defending her father to the end. Hedwig died in 1994, having never spoken publicly about her relationship with Himmler. The current whereabouts and status of Helga and Nanette Dorothea remain unknown, protected by their determined anonymity. What remains is the historical record, the testimony of survivors, the documentation of crimes, and the questions that continue to haunt us. How could ordinary people participate in such evil? How do families cope with the legacy of perpetrators in their midst? What responsibility do descendants bear for crimes committed before they were born? And how can societies balance the need for historical memory with compassion for individuals who bear the burden of terrible family legacies through no fault of their own? The Himmler family story does not provide easy answers to these questions. Instead, it illustrates the complexity, the moral ambiguity, and the human cost of trying to live in the aftermath of genocide. It reminds us that the Holocaust did not end in 1945. Its effects continue to reverberate through generations, affecting not just the descendants of victims, but also the descendants of perpetrators, creating ripples of pain and complication that extend far beyond the original crimes. In the end, Heinrich Himmler's legacy is one of almost incomprehensible evil. But the legacy of his family members is more complicated. Some, like Gudrun, actively perpetuated that evil through denial and support for unrepentant Nazis. Others, like Margarete, lived in a grey area of complicity and willful ignorance. Still others, like Helga and Nanette Dorothea, chose to disappear rather than confront or defend their father's crimes. Each response tells us something about the impossible choices faced by those connected to perpetrators of genocide. As we reflect on these stories, we should remember that behind the infamous name, behind the historical significance, behind the moral complexity, there were and are real human beings trying to navigate impossible circumstances. This does not excuse those who defended Heinrich Himmler or denied his crimes, but it does remind us that the effects of historical atrocities are vast and unpredictable, touching lives in ways we might never fully understand. Well, that's it. Thanks for watching. We hope you found this video informative and thought-provoking. The story of Heinrich Himmler's family reveals the long shadow cast by the Holocaust and the complex ways that families deal with legacies of evil. If you enjoyed today's topic, make sure to check out our video, What Happened to the Children of Nazi Leaders After World War II, which explores similar themes with other families affected by Nazi crimes. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell to stay updated on more World War II content. Understanding history, including its darkest chapters and their long-term effects, is crucial for ensuring such atrocities are never repeated. See you in the next one.